I'd like to introduce you to my digital Mamiya 645. Buckle up, this might be a little bit of a longer one. What's up? My name is Walter. I'm a photographer and commercial filmmaker based in southeastern United States. And on this channel, I'm all about trying to put the fun back into professional photography. So if that's something that tickles your funny bone, subscribe for more crap from me. This is the Fujifilm GFX 50S2, my new medium format camera that by all effective measures is sort of replacing my Mamiya 645, at least in how often I choose to use each one. So please stick with me while I try to explain myself and maybe you can relate to this in some way. Also, this is not a full comprehensive review of this camera as I haven't had it for too long yet. It's also not a first impressions video because I've had it longer than that. So consider this to be more of a, hey, I've been using this camera for a little bit and this is how I use it kind of video. And I'll do a more complete review maybe a few months from now. I made a video about the Mamiya 645 a few weeks ago and I expressed then that I had gotten bit by the medium format bug after renting the GFX 50S2 for a wedding I shot earlier this year. I loved the experience of shooting with it and I love the image quality of the photos themselves, just all around a great experience for me that really fits my shooting style. But GFX cameras are just expensive and I already owned several professional digital cameras, both full frame and Fujifilm crop sensors. So at the time, I just really couldn't justify buying into the GFX system on top of it. But again, I really loved the image quality from medium format and how it made me shoot, which led me down the path of medium format film. So I thought that getting the Mamiya 645, a camera that's a fraction of the cost of a GFX, would satiate my desire for a GFX and even give me a better experience and final result than a GFX would. But like I mentioned in that previous video and earlier in this one, I eventually found the continued cost of shooting film to be a hurdle that I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I had to ask myself if I'd rather have a larger one-time investment up front or buckle down and keep paying a couple $100s every time I needed to get a few rolls of film developed. And obviously I picked the one-time investment. So at this point, you may be asking why I wanted to shoot with medium format so badly when I already have all these other cameras, both film and digital, that are already very much getting the job done for me. At no point in my career has anyone ever chastised me for shooting full frame digital instead of medium format, or that my photos are just okay, and if I was shooting medium format, I would instantly become a much better photographer. No, none of that has ever happened. I don't believe it's happened to anybody. In fact, none of my journey with medium format has been dictated by any outside forces at all. It's just me and what I like. So I came to the decision that shooting medium format film all the time just wasn't going to be viable for me, right? The problem that I created for myself was that I had already fallen in love with the look that I was getting from my Mamiya 645. Ooh, tongue twister. And I was going to be heartbroken, okay, if I had to give that up entirely. I knew I was always going to be chasing that look until I had it again. So I started examining what specifically I really liked about the scans from my Mamiya. Was it the grain response? Maybe. Was it the colors? Sure, but that's also really dependent on the type of film you use and how it was developed and scanned. You know, maybe it was about the depth of field and subject separation that you really only get with medium format. I felt like I was getting a little bit closer. What about the lens I was using? I think I'm onto something here. What if I could take the Mamiya lens, specifically this 80mm 2.8 that came with the camera, and put it on a digital camera, but a camera with a sensor size that at least comes close to that of the Mamiya 645? Bingo. At this point, I knew it was time to take a leap. One that I had considered back when I used the GFX for the first time earlier this year, but then pushed it out of my mind for some reason. I finally made the decision that it was time to graduate from the Fujifilm X mount. Because see, I couldn't justify keeping all of my Fujifilm XF equipment and then adding in the GFX kit because I already have two full frame Sony cameras and the Nikon ZF. The GFX on top of all of that, plus my Fujifilm X-T5 kit would just be extreme overkill, and I just had a feeling that the GFX was gonna render my X-T5 mostly unused. So I had to remove all my emotional attachment that I have to my X-T5, and there was a lot of emotional attachment, as well as all the lenses, and sell them off to someone else who can start their own journey with it. So no longer do I own the X-T5, the 18mm 1.4, the 33mm 1.4, or the 56mm 1.2, all lenses that I loved on a camera that I loved even more. But they're gone. And it's bittersweet because as much as I loved all that equipment, my needs and shooting style have just changed, and they no longer have a place in my camera bag. At least not for now. So after all that, after spending this entire summer agonizing over this decision, I did what I knew I was always going to do, and I graduated from the X-T5 to the Fujifilm GFX 50S2. I could not be happier. Now let me finally tell you why. The entire GFX lineup from Fujifilm is certainly special, and it's not hard to figure out why. Medium format digital is just really tough to do well, and because it's generally more expensive for functionally harder to use cameras, their appeal to working photographers can be quite limited. It's a really hard sell to someone like me, a documentary style photographer, to say, okay, here's this huge and heavy camera that you can maybe get for $2,500 used, and the autofocus will be borderline unusable. The file's bigger than you'll ever need, with a first-party lens lineup that's almost prohibitively expensive, where the other option against all of that is spending that same amount of money on a full-frame Sony with image quality and autofocus and overall usability that's so good you barely even have to think when you press the shutter button. That's a tough sell. So on paper, the GFX doesn't really make sense for most people, and that's totally fine because we're not looking on paper. See, all of these specs and conversations about usability ignore what it's like to actually shoot with these cameras and what the final results really look and feel like. While not quite as big as the sensor in a Mamiya 645, the sensor in the GFX 50S2 is still bigger than a full-frame camera, and not insignificantly so. When you change the sensor size in a camera, the way it renders that image and interacts with whatever lenses you're using is just going to be inherently different. A bigger sensor means that more light can be gathered, allowing for a better low light performance than most other cameras. It means it's gathering more information, allowing your file sizes to be bigger and more malleable than others. It means changing the way your images can look and feel. And that is the main draw of the GFX for me. My images just look and feel different to me with it. If you watched my first video about the GFX a few months ago, you'll know that I adapted my old Zeiss Pancolor 50mm 1.8 to it, which is a lens originally made for 35mm film SLRs, which have smaller sensors than the GFX. You do get some vignetting with a lens like that, but it's more than serviceable in post, and it can even add to the vintage and film-like vibe when shot on the GFX. And that experience was great. But since then, having gotten and used the Mamiya 80mm 2.8 on real medium format film, I saw how much better suited actual medium format lenses can be to a medium format digital camera like a GFX. These lenses were made to be used with a bigger sensor as opposed to adapting 35mm SLR lenses. Again, a lot of those can work pretty well, and I still use it on my GFX, but putting Mamiya medium format lenses on the GFX 50S2 is just another league. The 80mm 2.8 lens here from Mamiya is usually the kit lens that comes with the camera. In a foregone era, when camera manufacturers actually cared about the kit lenses that they provided with their cameras. None of that zoom lens, variable aperture crap. This lens was the real deal and gave photographers the ability to take really high quality photos without having to spend even more money beyond the camera kit to get an actually good lens. On the Mamiya 645, it's equivalent to like a 50mm field of view in full frame terms, and it is just a real pleasure to use on this camera. I love the 50mm field of view, and I even made a whole video about falling back in love with that focal length a couple of months ago, so I was really happy when I found out that this lens came with the Mamiya, at least with the one that I purchased. Like I alluded to earlier, the sensor of the GFX is not quite as big as the one in the Mamiya 645, so a different calculation must be used to determine the effective field of view when you use this lens on the GFX. According to OmniCalculator.com, which is a very helpful resource for those who are using different sensor sizes like me, this Mamiya 80mm 2.8 on the GFX 50S2 can be seen more of like a 63mm with an effective f-stop of 2.2, at least in terms of depth of field, not light gathering. All of that makes this lens, in my opinion, a very capable portrait lens. You know, you get the compression that comes along with the 80mm focal length. Gosh, this core's pissing me off. But you get an effective field of view that's a good bit more versatile and easy to work with. It makes it easier to shoot inside as you don't have to back up as much, and it still gives your subject a pleasing and flattering level of facial distortion that feels quite natural as well. And if you're not familiar with that medium format look, this lens has it in spades, even at 2.8, which is not super wide open compared to some of the other lenses that you can get, especially on full frame. You still get a really nice subject separation here. There's a very smooth focus fall off that occurs at 2.8, and the natural depth of field that comes from it really gives your subject that kind of 3D effect that so many portrait photographers crave. Alongside that great subject separation from this lens, you also have just that almost inexplicable film look that it renders. I mean, it was made for a film camera, so of course you get that here. You know, it's very sharp and detailed, but still retains that slightly dreamy quality about it, especially wide open at 2.8. And every time I shoot with this lens and then pull up the images in Lightroom, I still find myself just so impressed with how sharp and detailed it is considering its age and that it wasn't made for digital shooting. But as sharp as it is, it's not too sharp. Like, it doesn't give off that Sony G Master vibe where it's so insanely sharp that it just looks digital and, to me, lacking a lot of soul. No, okay, that's no dig at G Master lenses, because there's definitely a place in photography for stupidly sharp lenses like that. It's just not what I like in my own photography and what I like to shoot. So the 80mm 2.8 is just amazing, and it pairs so well with the GFX that I just had to expand my lineup here. I mean, I did spend $150 on the Mamiya to GFX adapter, which I'll talk about in a little bit, so I might as well get some more use out of it. And all this led me to the Mamiya 55mm 2.8, a lens that on the outside looked very similar to the 80 2.8. And when I first put it on the GFX, I found myself almost shocked with how similarly it rendered to its bigger brother here, with of course that more wide-angle field of view. In full-frame terms on the GFX, this acts more like a 43mm 2.2 around there, which can often be a lot easier to maneuver with an unpredictable shooting environment like a wedding. And that's why I use this lens in particular a lot at a wedding last weekend. The 55mm 2.8 was kind of my generalist lens as I was shooting this wedding. I felt comfortable shooting with it as my kind of documentary lens, capturing all the small unplanned moments. And I also used it as my main family and group lens to get all of those pose photos, as it's usually better to have like a mid-range focal length for stuff like that. This lens has also become my typical around the house family documenting lens, again due to its versatility in focal length. And it's very easy to use this to get like quick shots of my daughter or take on a little walk around the neighborhood with my camera in the back of the stroller. You know, I can pick it up really quick and get a really good natural looking photo without having to back up too much. This 55mm lens has relegated my 80mm lens to be more of a specialist portrait type of lens, which isn't a bad thing at all. It's really nice to know that I have a specific lens that I like to use for portraits, or when I just need a bit more reach, like during the ceremony at this wedding and the ensuing couple portraits I got right after. Using these two Mamiya lenses really makes me feel like I'm using the closest thing we'll ever get to a digital Mamiya 645. And while I would never try to tell anyone that the results I get from this setup look exactly like film or replace the experience of shooting an actual Mamiya 645, because if I did say those things, I would get crucified, I can tell you that it does get me like 90% there, which is all I was looking for from this experience. And I hope the photos that you've been seeing in this video give you a good idea of what I'm talking about, whether you actually like my photos or not. Now, as with any camera or lens or combination thereof, this is not a perfect setup, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm selling some kind of photographic utopia here, okay? The first hurdle is obviously the financial investment. While I still think the 50S2 specifically is probably the best value in the GFX lineup right now, which that's a whole nother conversation, don't have time for that in this video, it is still pretty expensive for a slow and harder to use camera, and the used prices are only going up, at least in my country. Just a few months ago when I was looking at prices, you could snag one of these closer to maybe like $2,100. Now, if you find a good one at $2,500, that's a really good deal that you should absolutely get if you're in the market for one. So the camera body itself is expensive relative to other similarly priced cameras. Then you have the lenses. If you already own a Mamiya 645 and you're thinking about moving over to a Fuji GFX, there's a good chance that the 80mm 2.8 came with the camera, so at least you're good there. But if you don't already have that, then you're going to need to spend about $250 on that lens if you want that one. Then, if you want to expand your lineup, you'll be spending another $200 to $300 on another lens like the 55mm. But of course, you can't actually use those lenses on your GFX until you get the adapter for it. There are a few different options out there, but I would warn pretty strongly against cheaping out in this department, as I've seen a lot of stories online from people who get the absolutely cheapest adapter that they can find, and after 2 weeks, it's falling apart, and your lens might even fall off the camera and get damaged. No one wants that. You spend a lot of money on these lenses in this camera, so don't put a cheap adapter between the two of them. So I spent like $150 on the Kipon adapter, and so far so good. It had really good reviews, specifically about durability, and I can tell you firsthand that I don't have any problems with it. But It is quite big, which brings me into my next con about this setup. These lenses with this adapter on this camera makes for a quite bulky setup, and it's even bigger than my old Nikon DSLRs that I used to shoot on. This isn't always a bad thing, as I do have bigger hands that feel quite comfortable while using this camera with these lenses, but some people with smaller hands or just less tolerance for size and weight might find something like this to be a deal breaker. Not to mention that it can be a little intimidating to look at to people who aren't photographers. I didn't find any issues with it while shooting this wedding last weekend, but this would be a really tough sell to maybe a street photographer or the traveling photographer, you know, people who really value small size and weight so that they can be as discreet as possible or keep the weight down as much as they can in a smaller bag that they're traveling with. Again, for me, this isn't that big of a deal as it's quite manageable in my hands and I don't travel a ton, but I can certainly see why it just wouldn't work for some people. Now, I know in the negative section here is when everyone talks about how bad the autofocus is on this camera, but I've never used the autofocus on this camera, so I don't care. Let's move on to the next one. The last little negative I have with these lenses is that their focus throw is quite stiff and slow. I think this is by design, as they weren't meant to be used for super quick action, much like the GFX itself, but it can be quite cumbersome sometimes when you're shooting something far away at infinity, and then you have to shoot something, you know, right in front of you, and you kind of have to really work to get your focus where it needs to be. Not a huge deal, not a deal breaker for me necessarily, but I didn't really notice how slow the focusing was until I was shooting this wedding and, for, several hours at a time. And then I swapped out my Mamiya 55mm 2.8 for the Voigtlander 40mm 1.2, which we'll talk about right now. I've had this Voigtlander lens for a little while now, and I originally got it from my Nikon ZF, a pairing that is still really good. Voigtlander does make this lens with a native Z mount for Nikon mirrorless, but I'm really glad I future-proofed myself and got the M mount version of this lens, which means I can adapt it to almost any camera I want to, including the 50S2. Mounting full-frame lenses to medium format cameras is nothing new. In fact, that's what I did with this camera when I rented it for the first time earlier this year, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video. If you can deal with a little bit of vignetting, depending on the lens that you're using, there are a ton of great full-frame lenses that you can just throw onto the GFX with some really great results, and that is no exception with this Voigtlander 40mm 1.2. On the GFX, using our omnicalculator.com again, it equates to about a 31mm f/0.95, which is just insane. I actually rarely shoot with this lens on the GFX at 1.2, as it's just almost impossible to nail focus unless your subject is completely still. Your depth of field is just absolutely razor thin. I mean, it is brutal. For me, I found that stopping it down to f2 is enough for me to grab focus much more confidently while still keeping that really unique rendering with the focus fall off and, the bokeh and out of focus areas and all that. I tend to grab this lens when I want to slim down my GFX setup, as it is quite small. What's even smaller though is the adapter. I just use a simple TT Artisan M to GF adapter, and it is a pretty low profile ring here, which is in pretty sharp contrast to the Kaipon adapter I have to use for the Mamiya lenses. I mean, this thing is just a big metal tube, much bigger than the little ring here for M mount lenses. I also like to use this lens when I need just something wider than the Mamiya 55 2.8. Around a 30mm field of view is a really nice all-purpose experience. I can take it just about anywhere, and I know that I can take probably most of the photos I want to take and do it in an overall package that is relatively small and lightweight. And like I alluded to earlier, this lens focuses much quicker and easier than the Mamiya lenses. The focus throw feels way smoother, and I don't feel like I'm working as hard when I'm using it compared to those Mamiyas. My only gripe with this lens, and it's kind of an important one, is that I don't always love the look that it gives. It's good for some things, but the whole reason I got this camera was so that I could use my Mamiya lenses to achieve the film look that I really like. And while the Voigtlander here is incredible, it just, to me, has more of a modern look than the Mamiyas. It's not a bad look at all, and the lens is crazy sharp, so don't hear me say that the lens is bad. Even if you're shooting wide open at 1.2, it is still really sharp as long as you can nail focus. It's just a different look from the Mamiyas, and it's not one that I always love. It does give me crazy subject separation and a very unique bokeh, and it's great to have that when I want it. But if I'm shooting very seriously and trying to get the look that I really want to get from my GFX, I'm grabbing one of the Mamiya lenses first. I knew I was going to bring my 50S2 to a football game this past weekend, not as an official photographer or anything, but just to bring it to the stands with me and take some photos for fun from where we were sitting, and I could have brought one of my Mamiya lenses and took some good photos with it, but I really did not want to have to lug around that big heavy setup all day in the heat, and the stadium's rules don't allow for really big lenses, so I'm not even sure they would have allowed that in the first place considering how big the Mamiya adapter is, that one from Kaipon. So the Voigtlander 40mm was the obvious choice there, and it was still really fun to shoot with, and I like the images that I got. Okay, to quote every youth pastor ever, let's land this plane. I try really hard not to fall into the honeymoon phase with new equipment anymore, as I've sometimes had to eat my words after I finally stop ignoring some glaring issues that I've had with different equipment. And while I can't definitively say I'm not on the honeymoon phase at all with the GFX 50S2, I can say that I feel my thoughts about the camera right now are as measured as they possibly can be. I really, really like this camera, and the reason I feel like I'm being more measured with it now is that I knew what it was all about before I bought it. I know what it's good for, and I know when I need to put it down and use my Nikon ZF instead. I know that it is never going to be a video camera nor a fast action camera for me, which is why I will always have a fast autofocus camera like the ZF alongside it when I'm shooting something like a wedding. But for right now, I'm enjoying the GFX 50S2 immensely, and while I do miss my XT5 from a pure emotional, nostalgic standpoint, I'm not missing it from the actual shooting and final result standpoint. I feel like the look I'm getting from the GFX, especially with the Mamiya lenses, is the closest I've ever gotten to the look that I've been chasing for a little bit now. I'm really excited to keep going with it for as long as it makes sense, and I hope you stick around the channel to see what else I create with it, because this will be far from the last video I ever make that features the GFX 50S2. Speaking of sticking around the channel, I'm glad you stopped by. I make one video a week about whatever it is that I've been shooting or thinking about since last week, and I'd love if you became a part of the community that I've been creating here. We have a lot of fun talking shop and even arguing sometimes in the comments, so subscribe if you want to see more crap like that from me. You can also follow me on Instagram, the link is in the description, where I try to post more of my work. I try to not to get on there too much, but you can even DM me on there if you have further questions about me or my work. I am an open book. I like to be very accessible to people, so I'm always happy to talk to anybody about anything regarding photography. Please, I'm serious, message me on Instagram, talk to me about whatever you want to talk about. I want to talk to you. You can support me further by liking this video and leaving a comment with your thoughts, both things that tell the algorithm that this video is worth watching for other people. This cable, for some reason, it's making me so angry. If you want to support me even more than subscribing and all that, you can check out my preset pack. The link is also in the description if you like the way I edit my colors and want to give yourself a similar starting point with your photos. And if you don't want to do any of that, that's totally fine, because I will see you in the algorithm in 6 months.